Ever wondered what medieval people really thought about getting frisky before saying, "I do"? Did the church control everything, or was there more to the story? Were all unmarried lovers doomed to eternal damnation, or did medieval society have a more complex understanding of human desire? Number 7. The secret night visitors. Concubinage in medieval Europe. In the shadowy corners of medieval bedchambers, a practice flourished that today might raise eyebrows, but back then occupied a strange middle ground in society. Concubinage. These weren't just casual flings or one-night stands. Concubines were women who lived with men in stable, long-term relationships without the blessing of official marriage. In early medieval Europe, concubinage actually existed as a semi-recognized institution, especially among nobility. A man might keep a concubine alongside, or sometimes instead of a legal wife. The children of these unions weren't considered fully legitimate, but they weren't entirely disowned either. They occupied a liminal social space, not quite heirs, not quite outcasts. Take Charlemagne, the mighty emperor who unified much of Western Europe. While celebrating his piety and commitment to Christian values, medieval chroniclers casually mention his multiple concubines. Before and during his various marriages, he maintained relationships with at least 4 documented concubines, who bore him several children. Some of these offspring even received positions of power and influence. One of his sons, by a concubine, Pepin the Hunchback, nearly inherited the throne before falling out of favor. The church officially frowned upon concubinage, of course. St. Augustine himself had kept a concubine for 15 years before dismissing her to make a more socially advantageous marriage, something he later seemed to regret. By the 13th century, ecclesiastical authorities were increasingly cracking down on the practice. Yet it persisted stubbornly, especially in areas like medieval Spain, where Visigothic law codes explicitly recognized the status of the Barragana, concubine. For ordinary people, concubinage sometimes served practical purposes. Marriage required financial resources for dowries and property arrangements that poorer folks simply couldn't afford. Some couples essentially lived as husband and wife without formal matrimony, creating de facto marriages recognized by their communities, if not by the church. In late medieval Portugal, these informal unions were so common that local customs developed to protect the inheritance rights of these natural children. What's particularly fascinating is how concubinage sometimes protected women in ways formal marriage couldn't. A noblewoman married off for political alliance might find herself treated as little more than a broodmare, while a concubine might enjoy a relationship based at least partly on genuine affection. Some concubines wielded surprising influence, particularly in early medieval courts, where the lines between legitimate and illegitimate relationships remained blurry. By the late Middle Ages, church reforms and tightening social controls had pushed concubinage increasingly to the margins. Yet the practice never disappeared entirely. It adapted and survived in various forms, reflecting the gap between official moral teachings and the messy reality of medieval relationships. Number 6. Wandering hearts. Sex and romance among medieval travelers. The medieval world wasn't as static as we sometimes imagine. Roads bustled with merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, and wanderers of all sorts. And where people traveled, sexual opportunities and temptations followed. Medieval pilgrimage routes created fascinating spaces where normal social rules sometimes bent or broke entirely. Pilgrims journeying to Santiago de Compostela, Rome, or Jerusalem temporarily stepped outside their usual social networks and constraints. Church authorities constantly complained about the sexual misadventures happening along these supposedly sacred routes. The 12th century Codex Calixtinus, a guide for Santiago pilgrims, specifically warns travelers about lustful innkeepers and local women who might tempt them into sin. These weren't just prudish concerns. Records from pilgrim hostels and contemporary accounts confirm that some pilgrimage routes developed reputations for sexual license. As one French bishop lamented in 1428, some women claimed to be going on pilgrimage, but were really wandering about the country in order to indulge their lust. Modern historians have found court records describing women who took advantage of pilgrimage to escape unhappy marriages or to pursue romantic adventures away from the watchful eyes of their communities. Merchants faced similar temptations and opportunities while traveling. Medieval trading centers like Bruges, Venice, or the Champagne fairs hosted visitors from across Europe and beyond, creating motel mixing grounds. Local authorities often regulated prostitution specifically with these visiting merchants in mind. In some trading cities, authorities actually viewed commercial sex as a necessary service for visiting businessmen, preferring that temporary visitors satisfy their desires with prostitutes rather than seducing local unmarried women or wives. Soldiers represented another highly mobile population with notorious reputations for illicit sexuality. From crusader armies to mercenary companies, military men often lived outside normal social constraints. Medieval commanders struggled to control their troops' sexual behavior, particularly during campaigns in foreign territories. After the conquest of Constantinople in 1204, Western crusaders notoriously assaulted nuns and respectable women, behavior condemned even by their contemporaries. Yet medieval military camps also fostered longer-term connections. Camp followers, including laundresses, cooks, and sex workers, often formed relationships with soldiers that existed in a gray area, neither fully legitimate nor completely condemned. For medieval travelers of all kinds, being away from home created both freedom and vulnerability. A merchant might maintain a second relationship in a distant port city, essentially leading a double life. A female pilgrim might find romantic adventure on the road to Santiago. A soldier might father children in multiple countries during various campaigns. These mobile populations challenged the ideal of stable, community-sanctioned marriages in ways that medieval authorities struggled to control. Perhaps most poignant were the relationships that formed among people from wildly different backgrounds who would never have met except for medieval mobility. Court records occasionally reveal these cross-cultural romances, like the 13th century case of a Muslim woman in Valencia who converted to Christianity after falling in love with a Christian merchant. These relationships rarely had happy endings in the historical record, but they remind us that medieval people, like us, sometimes followed their hearts across religious and cultural boundaries, even when society disapproved. Number 5. Between heaven and earth, clerical sexuality in medieval times. No wife, no sex, no exceptions. That's what we might assume was the rule for medieval priests, monks, and other clergy. The reality, considerably messier. Adultery celibacy for priests actually took centuries to become firmly established in Western Christianity. While early church fathers praised virginity, many early medieval priests married openly. Pope Gregory VII's reforms in the 11th century aimed to end clerical marriage once and for all, but change came slowly and unevenly. Well into the 12th century, priestly marriages persisted in many areas, especially in rural regions far from reforming bishops. Even after clerical marriage was officially stamped out, priests' housekeepers became something of a medieval joke. These women, officially employed as domestic servants, often functioned as unofficial wives. Local communities frequently knew the real situation and sometimes accepted these arrangements pragmatically. The children of priests, known as sons of the church in medieval documents, occupied a special category, technically illegitimate but often educated and sometimes able to inherit property or even follow their fathers into the priesthood after receiving dispensation for their defect of birth. The severity of punishment for clerical sexual activity varied wildly. A 13th century English bishop might fine an offending priest but leave him in his position. In another diocese, the same offense might result in suspension from duties. Much depended on local customs, the priest's connections, and whether the relationship had caused public scandal. Monks and nuns faced even stricter expectations than parish priests, having taken explicit vows of chastity. Yet medieval monastic records regularly mention sexual misconduct. The great Benedictine Abbey of Cluny built separate cells for monks who couldn't control their desires. Some monasteries employed paid servants who, according to visitors' reports, sometimes shared monks' beds. Female religious houses faced particular scrutiny with male church authorities, obsessively concerned about preserving nuns' virginity, sometimes to the point of walling them up completely from outside contact. One of the most fascinating aspects of clerical sexuality was how it created distinct legal and social categories. The children of priests formed a recognized social group with specific legal disabilities, but also certain protections. In parts of medieval Scandinavia and Iceland, where Christianity arrived relatively late, the sons of priests actually formed influential dynasties, inheriting church positions from their fathers despite official prohibitions. Perhaps most surprising to modern readers, medieval people sometimes distinguished between different types of clerical sexual sins. A priest who maintained a stable relationship with one woman, essentially a common law marriage, might face less community condemnation than one who visited prostitutes or seduced parishioners. This practical distinction appears in both court records and popular literature, suggesting a nuanced understanding that official church teaching didn't always acknowledge. By the later Middle Ages, reformers increasingly targeted clerical concubinage, pushing these relationships further underground. Yet they never disappeared entirely. On the eve of the Reformation, clerical celibacy remained an ideal that many priests aspired to, but that a significant minority quietly circumvented. The persistence of clerical relationships across centuries of prohibition reveals how even the powerful medieval church couldn't completely override human desires for companionship and intimacy. Number 4. Nature's urges. Mythical views on sexual desire as a physical need. Did medieval people believe sexual desire was a sin, or did they see it as a natural human function like hunger or thirst? The answer is fascinatingly complex. Medieval medicine, drawing heavily on ancient Greek and Arabic sources, often viewed sexual desire as a physical necessity, particularly for men. According to humoral theory, the dominant medical framework of the time semen was considered a vital fluid that needed regular release for good health. Too much retention could lead to everything from headaches to madness. This medical view created an interesting tension with religious teachings that idealized complete abstinence. Constantine the African, an 11th century medical writer, explicitly compared sexual release to other bodily functions. The emission of sperm is necessary in every animal, just as it is necessary to expel urine. Other medieval medical texts warned that excessive semen retention could lead to serious illnesses or even death. For young, unmarried men, this created a genuine dilemma. Their bodies supposedly required sexual release, yet religious authorities condemned any sexual activity outside marriage. Women's sexual desire received more complicated treatment in medieval thinking. While some medical texts portrayed women as naturally more lustful than men, drawing on Aristotelian ideas about females being cold and therefore craving male heat, Others emphasized female modesty and restraint. By the later Middle Ages, medical writers increasingly pathologized female desire, developing elaborate treatments for uterine fury, excessive female lust, while simultaneously claiming that female pleasure was necessary for conception. These medical understandings influenced how some medieval authorities approached sexuality in practical contexts. Monastery rules sometimes made pragmatic accommodations for monks' physical needs, allowing occasional bloodletting, partly because it was thought to reduce sexual urges by rebalancing the humors. University towns developed regulated prostitution, partly based on the medical argument that young male students needed sexual outlets for their health. Even some religious thinkers acknowledged the reality of physical desire while trying to channel it appropriately. The influential 12th century theologian Peter Lombard admitted that sexual pleasure itself wasn't inherently sinful within marriage. Thomas Aquinas categorized different sexual acts partly based on how far they deviated from natural reproductive purposes, creating a hierarchy of sexual sins rather than condemning all sexual desire equally. Medieval confessors' manuals reveal particularly nuanced approaches to human sexuality. While officially condemning all non-marital sex, these practical guides for priests often suggested moderate penances for natural sins, like simple fornication between unmarried people, saving their harshest judgments for unnatural acts that couldn't lead to reproduction. Some confessors' manuals even advised priests to consider a penitent's age, temperament, and circumstances when assigning penances for sexual sins, implicitly acknowledging that physical desire affected different people with different intensities. Intriguingly, by the later Middle Ages, some medical and religious writers developed the concept of the marriage debt, the idea that spouses owed each other sexual access as a duty of marriage. This concept recognized sexual fulfillment as a legitimate need while attempting to confine it within matrimony. Court records show medieval women sometimes sued for annulment based on their husband's impotence, suggesting that female sexual satisfaction was considered a valid concern within marriage, even if female desire outside marriage remained deeply stigmatized. This complex medieval understanding of sexual desire as both natural and dangerous, physical and moral, created space for practical accommodations while maintaining official disapproval of non-marital sexuality. The tension between physical needs and spiritual ideals remained unresolved throughout the period, producing contradictions that medieval people navigated in their daily lives. Number 3. Betrothed and bedded. Premarital sex. Between engaged couple. Were engaged couples in medieval times expected to wait until after the wedding to consummate their relationship? The boundaries might surprise you. For much of the medieval period, the line between betrothal and marriage remained surprisingly fluid. Until the Council of Trent in 1563, technically after the medieval period, the Church didn't mandate that marriages take place in churches with priests officiating. Instead, mutual consent between the couple legally created the marriage bond. This meant that when a betrothed couple had sex, many medieval people viewed this as effectively activating or consummating their marriage rather than constituting a sin. Evidence from church courts shows that many couples didn't wait for the formal wedding ceremony before beginning their sexual relationship. In 14th century England, it was common for a couple to be handfast, formally betrothed, and begin living together before the church wedding took place. When these relationships were later challenged in church courts, many defendants argued that they considered themselves already married once betrothal and sexual consummation had occurred. The Church's legal position evolved over the medieval period. Initially, early medieval authorities like Pope Gregory I, 590 to 604, suggested that betrothal plus sexual intercourse essentially constituted marriage. By the 12th century, legal scholars distinguished between marriage initiated by consent betrothal and marriage ratified by sexual consummation. Both were considered binding, but the latter more definitively so. This legal ambiguity created practical consequences in medieval communities. Pregnancy often precipitated the formal church wedding rather than following it. Parish records and court cases repeatedly show patterns where couples became officially wed shortly before the birth of their first child. Rather than being scandalous, this timing appears to have been socially acceptable in many communities, as long as the couple had previously been betrothed. Regional variations were significant. In medieval Scandinavia, the feast of betrothal, fastening, had such legal importance that sexual relations afterward were widely accepted. In parts of Italy, formal betrothal, sponsalia, created family connections almost as binding as marriage itself. In some German regions, the practice of testing the bride, Proben noted, allowed engaged couples to spend nights together, ostensibly to confirm the woman's fertility before finalizing the marriage. The Church increasingly tried to clarify these blurry lines, especially after the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. Priests were instructed to announce bans of marriage, ceremonies were supposed to be public, and the distinction between betrothal and marriage was emphasized. Yet, practice changed slowly. Even church court judges sometimes showed leniency toward couples who had sex after being formally betrothed, assigning lighter penances compared to those who had casual sexual encounters. For ordinary medieval people, betrothal often represented the real beginning of the couple's relationship. The formal church ceremony, when it occurred, might happen months or even years later, when the couple had gathered sufficient resources to establish their household. During this interval, many couples began their sexual relationship with at least some community acceptance, if not outright approval. Perhaps most telling are the medieval wedding customs themselves. In many regions, the marriage bed would be blessed as part of the celebration, with the couple expected to consummate the union, while wedding guests waited nearby, sometimes even witnessing the couple entering the bedchamber. Sex wasn't a shameful secret, but an expected, celebrated part of creating a marriage bond. The question wasn't whether sex would occur, but exactly when in the process from betrothal to wedding feast it became appropriate. Number 2. Love's labor lost. Pregnancy, legitimacy, and community response. What happened when unmarried medieval women became pregnant? Were they automatically outcasts? Or did medieval communities develop more nuanced responses? Contrary to popular belief, medieval villages and towns didn't universally cast out unwed mothers. Court records and church registers reveal a range of community responses, from harsh punishment to integration and support. Much depended on local customs, the woman's social status, and the specific circumstances of her pregnancy. For peasant communities where labor was valuable, pragmatism often prevailed over strict moral judgment. A pregnant servant might face dismissal from a wealthy household, but find acceptance in her home village, where her child would eventually provide another pair of working hands. Manor court records from 14th century England show unwed mothers pay modest fines for childbite, pregnancy outside marriage, and then continuing their lives in the community, sometimes finding another husband entirely. The economic consequences of illegitimacy varied dramatically by social class. For nobility, illegitimate birth could mean exclusion from inheritance, but not necessarily from all privileges. Many illegitimate sons of noblemen received education, land grants, or church positions arranged by their fathers. William the Conqueror, himself born to an unwed relationship, his mother was the daughter of a tanner, openly acknowledged his illegitimate half-brothers and gave them positions of power in his government. For peasant families, illegitimacy had fewer formal legal consequences, though illegitimate children might receive smaller inheritance portions than their legitimate siblings. Medieval communities developed practical systems for dealing with unmarried pregnant women. In some regions, community pressure would be applied to convince the father to marry the mother. Church courts sometimes ordered men to either marry their pregnant lovers or provide financial support for the child, an early form of paternity suit. If the father couldn't be identified or refused responsibility, extended family networks often absorbed the additional child, with grandparents or aunts helping raise the baby. Abandonment of infants born outside marriage did occur, but medieval people developed institutional responses to this problem. By the late Middle Ages, many Italian cities had established foundling hospitals with special revolving doors, ruota, where mothers could anonymously leave unwanted babies. The Hospital of the Innocents in Florence took in thousands of abandoned children, many of them illegitimate. Church officials debated whether such institutions encouraged immoral behavior, but the practical need to prevent infanticide usually won these arguments. Pregnancy could sometimes force the revelation of secret relationships. Church court records contain numerous cases where pregnant women testified about promises of marriage they had received from men who later denied the relationship. These testimonies provide remarkable glimpses into intimate moments, descriptions of private conversations, gifts exchanged, and sexual encounters, all recounted in public court as women fought to establish their children's legitimacy. Perhaps most surprising to modern readers, medieval communities sometimes distinguished between different types of illegitimacy. Children born to stable, long-term relationships outside marriage, such as clerical marriages or relationships between betrothed couples, often faced less stigma than those resulting from casual encounters. Local terms developed to distinguish these categories, such as the English distinction between children born at the altar steps to betrothed parents versus those considered truly baseborn. By the later Middle Ages, legitimization mechanisms had developed that could remove the legal disabilities of illegitimate birth. Papal legitimization was available for a fee to those who could afford it. Royal legitimization letters could similarly erase the stain of illegitimacy for favored individuals. Some regions developed customs whereby subsequent marriage of the parents legitimized previously born children, a principle eventually adopted into canon law. Through all these responses, medieval communities balanced moral disapproval of non-marital sex with practical recognition of human reality. The pregnant, unwed woman might face punishment, usually in the form of public penance or fines, but rarely permanent exclusion. Her child, though disadvantaged in some ways, had recognized places within medieval society and paths to integration. Number 1, the market of desire. Medieval prostitution between sin and necessity. Was prostitution completely banned in the God-fearing Middle Ages? Or did medieval authorities find ways to accommodate the world's oldest profession? Walking through the narrow streets of medieval Paris, Florence, or London, you might have come across entire districts dedicated to commercial sex. Far from being hidden or underground, medieval prostitution often operated in designated areas with remarkable openness. By the 14th century, many European cities had official regulations controlling where and how prostitutes could work, not eliminating the trade, but containing and supervising it. Medieval attitudes toward prostitution embodied fascinating contradictions. Theologically, selling one's body was condemned as sinful. St. Augustine had established the principle that prostitution, while morally wrong, might be tolerated to prevent greater evils, like adultery or sexual assault. This pragmatic approach influenced many medieval authorities. As 13th century theologian Thomas Aquinas wrote, "Remove prostitutes from the world, and you will fill it with sodomy." City governments took remarkably practical approaches. In 13th century Montpellier, prostitutes had to wear distinctive clothing but received official protection. London authorities designated Southwark, conveniently outside city jurisdiction but across London Bridge, as a zone for stews, brothels. In many Italian cities, official municipal brothels operated under government supervision, with profits sometimes funding public works. Valencia's municipal brothel was so institutionalized that it closed only during Holy Week, reopening with civic ceremony after Easter. These regulated systems reached their peak in late medieval southern Europe. 15th century Avignon maintained a walled prostitution district where women worked under medical supervision, paid taxes, and even received retirement benefits after years of service. The municipal brothel of Dijon operated in a building owned by the Duke of Burgundy himself. In Venice, the Republic employed official barcaroli, gondoliers, to transport clients to the city's famous Castelletto district. The legal status of medieval sex workers varied enormously, depending on location and time period. In some cities, particularly in southern France and Italy, prostitutes formed guilds, paid taxes, and received certain legal protections. In other regions, particularly Northern Europe, they faced harsher restrictions and periodic expulsion campaigns. Almost everywhere, a distinction existed between good prostitutes, who followed local regulations, and common women who worked outside official systems, the former often enjoying surprising levels of legal protection, the latter facing harsher treatment. Day-to-day life for medieval prostitutes combined business practicalities with religious contradictions. Many brothels closed on religious holidays and Sundays. Prostitutes regularly left bequests to churches in their wills and founded chantries to pray for their souls. Some cities maintained conversion houses where sex workers could retire from the profession and live religious lives. Mary Magdalene, reinterpreted as a reformed prostitute, became a popular patron saint for women in the trade. Behind these institutional arrangements lay complex economic realities. For many women, particularly those without family support or skilled training, prostitution offered one of the few available income sources. Court records reveal stories of widows, abandoned wives, and servants who turned to prostitution temporarily during economic hardship. Others entered the profession through debt, coercion, or trafficking. Medieval authorities recognized and sometimes tried to address these abuses, though inconsistently. By the later Middle Ages, distinctive prostitution cultures had developed in different regions. Barcelona's prostitutes participated in civic processions, carrying banners and representing their district. In German cities, bathhouses often served as thinly disguised brothels, with elaborate rituals and customs. London's Southwark stews developed their own slang, fashion trends, and business practices that influenced popular culture. The late medieval period saw increasing attempts to reform or eliminate prostitution, particularly after outbreaks of syphilis in the 1490s. Religious reformers established Magdalene houses to rehabilitate sex workers. Some cities experimented with outright bans rather than regulation, yet these efforts had limited success. When Henry VIII officially closed London's Southwark brothels in 1546, most simply relocated or went underground rather than disappearing. Throughout these changes, medieval prostitution occupied a unique social position, morally condemned, yet practically tolerated, officially regulated, yet spiritually dangerous. For the women involved, it offered economic opportunities, alongside significant hazards and social marginalization. The clearest conclusion from historical evidence is that medieval authorities, whatever their official moral positions, generally chose regulated tolerance over ineffective prohibition, a pragmatic approach to managing desires they considered inevitable. Did medieval people really believe all non-marital sex led to eternal damnation? Or did everyday life in the Middle Ages include unspoken accommodations for human desire that challenge our stereotypes? When we look beyond simplified narratives about repression and control, What complex negotiations between official rules and human needs do we find in these distant centuries that might still resonate with our own struggles to balance desire, commitment, and social expectations?